There's a gate in Jerusalem that has captured the imagination of believers for centuries. It faces east. It's been sealed for nearly 500 years, and it appears in one of the most mysterious prophetic visions in all of Scripture. But what does the Bible actually say about this gate, and how should we understand it without getting swept up in speculation? Today, we're going to examine this passage together, carefully, biblically, and with the kind of clarity that brings peace rather than anxiety. Let's begin. If you've spent any time exploring this topic online, you've probably encountered dramatic claims, urgent language, sensational framing, and confident assertions about what's, quote, about to happen. And if those left you feeling more confused than confident, you're not alone. Here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. The Eastern Gate and the prophecy connected to it has been studied and discussed by faithful Christians for centuries. Godly scholars who love Scripture have held different views on what Ezekiel's vision means and how it connects to other biblical passages. What we're going to do today is something that's become rare. We're going to read the actual text. We're going to examine the historical and literary context. We're going to present different interpretive views fairly, and we're going to hold our conclusions with appropriate humility. Was because the goal of studying prophecy isn't speculation or fear, it's understanding God's character, it's growing in faith, and ultimately, it's hope. Let's start with the passage itself. To understand what Ezekiel says about the Eastern Gate, we need to understand when and why he wrote. Ezekiel was a Jewish priest taken into exile in Babylon around 597 BC. He prophesied to the Jewish exiles during one of the darkest periods in Israel's history, before and after Jerusalem's destruction in 586 BC. The final chapters of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48, contain an extended vision of a temple, a city, and restored worship. This vision came to Ezekiel in 573 BC, about 14 years after Jerusalem fell. Ezekiel chapter 40 verses 1 through 4 sets the scene. Quote, "In the 25th year of our exile, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there. And in visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel, and set me on a very high mountain, on which was a structure like a city to the south. A figure, quote, whose appearance was like bronze, then leads Ezekiel on an extensive tour of this temple complex, measuring gates, courts, chambers, and the sanctuary itself. In chapter 43, Ezekiel witnesses something breathtaking. Ezekiel chapter 43 verses 1 through 4. Quote, "Then he led me to the gate, as the gate facing east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. As the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The glory of God, which had departed from Jerusalem in Ezekiel's earlier vision in chapter 10, was returning, and it entered through the eastern gate." Then comes the passage that has generated so much discussion. Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 1 through 3. Quote, "Then he brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces east, and it was shut. And the Lord said to me, This gate shall remain shut. It shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it. For the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered by it. Therefore it shall remain shut. Only the prince may sit in it to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by way of the vestibule of the gate, and shall go out by the same way." I'll explain in a moment why this passage has generated such different interpretations among faithful scholars. Let's be careful to note exactly what the text states and what requires interpretation. What does the text explicitly say? Ezekiel sees a gate facing east in his temple vision. This gate is shut. God declares it will remain shut because he entered through it, and only the prince may sit in it to eat bread before the Lord. What requires interpretation? What temple is this? The second temple that would be rebuilt? A future millennial temple? A symbolic or spiritual reality? Who is the prince mentioned in verse 3? Is this gate the same as the current eastern gate in Jerusalem's walls? And how does this vision relate to other prophetic passages? Now, there is an actual gate in Jerusalem's old city walls that faces east. It's often called the Golden Gate, or the Gate of Mercy. Let me share what we actually know about it historically. The current structure dates to around the Byzantine period, likely the 6th or 7th century AD, though some scholars suggest earlier origins. It sits along the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. In 1541, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent ordered the gate sealed. The reasons aren't definitively documented, though various theories exist. Some are connected to Jewish and Christian prophetic expectations about the Messiah entering through the Eastern Gate. A Muslim cemetery has existed in front of the gate for centuries. The gate remains sealed today. But here's what most people miss about this passage. Ezekiel's vision describes a temple, but not necessarily the Temple Mount structure that exists in Jerusalem today. The temple Ezekiel describes in chapters 40 through 48 doesn't match the second temple that was actually built after the exile returned. This has led scholars to different conclusions. Some believe Ezekiel describes an ideal that was never literally built, a vision of what worship should look like under God's reign. Some believe Ezekiel describes a future temple that will be built during a millennial kingdom. Some believe the vision is symbolic, representing spiritual realities about God's presence with His people, and some see elements of all these interpretations working together. The point is this: faithful Christians hold genuinely different views on how to interpret Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, and that affects how they understand the sealed gate passage. Let me walk you through the different interpretive frameworks. First, the futurist or dispensational view. In this framework, Ezekiel's temple is a literal structure that will be built during a future millennial kingdom after Christ returns. The sealed eastern gate will be the gate through which Christ enters, or has already entered in a preliminary sense, and it remains sealed until He comes again. This view often connects Ezekiel 44 to Zechariah chapter 14 verse 4. Quote, "On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives," and to Acts chapter 1 verse 11. Quote, "And this same Jesus will come in the same way you saw Him go into heaven." The current sealed Golden Gate is sometimes seen as a prophetic placeholder, sealed by God's providence until the appointed time. Second, the symbolic or spiritual view. In this framework, Ezekiel's temple vision represents spiritual realities rather than literal architecture. The sealed gate symbolizes that God's entrance into relationship with His people is complete and inviolable, and no one can add to or alter what God has accomplished. Some in this tradition connect the imagery to Christ's words in John chapter 10 verse 9. Quote, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. The gate is sealed because the way of access to God is established through Christ alone." Third, the idealist view. Some interpreters see Ezekiel's temple as presenting ideals for worship and holiness, what should characterize God's people, rather than predicting specific buildings or gates. Fourth, the preterist view. Some scholars see elements of Ezekiel's vision as having been fulfilled in the restoration after exile or in the first coming of Christ, with remaining elements being symbolic of the church age. Now stay with me here, because understanding these different views helps us hold our own interpretation with appropriate humility. All of these frameworks are held by sincere, Bible-believing Christians who take Scripture seriously. This isn't a salvation issue. It's a matter of interpretive method. What we can all affirm together is what the passage reveals about God, His glory, His presence, His holiness, His sovereign control over access to sacred space. Regardless of your specific interpretive framework, Ezekiel chapter 44 verses 1 through 3 reveals profound truths. God's presence is holy. The gate is sealed because God entered through it. His passage sanctifies space. God's movements are purposeful. The glory departed through the east in judgment in Ezekiel chapter 10. The glory returns through the east in restoration in Ezekiel chapter 43. God's comings and goings are never random. God's plans are secure. Quote, "It shall remain shut." This is divine decree, not human decision. Whatever God purposes, He accomplishes. So where does this leave us? Let me offer you 3 takeaways to anchor your understanding. First, be careful about claims that go beyond what Scripture states. The text describes a gate in Ezekiel's temple vision. Whether that gate is identical to the current Golden Gate in Jerusalem, whether the vision is literal or symbolic, and how it connects to other passages, these are matters of interpretation where faithful scholars disagree. When someone speaks with absolute certainty about prophetic details that remain debated among careful students of Scripture, that's a signal to slow down and examine the claims more carefully. Second, the heart of this passage is God's glory, not our speculation. Ezekiel chapters 43 and 44 are fundamentally about God's presence returning to His people. The glory that departed is the glory that returns. The God who left is the God who comes back. That's the message that should shape how we read these chapters, not anxiety about gates and timelines, but wonder at a God who refuses to abandon His people. Third, all prophetic passages ultimately point to hope. Whether Ezekiel's temple is literal or symbolic, past or future, the direction is always the same: God dwelling with His people, holiness restored, worship renewed, the glory returning. Revelation chapter 21 verse 3 captures the ultimate fulfillment. Quote, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be His people, and God Himself will be with them as their God." That's where all these passages point, not to fear, but to the day when God's presence fills all things and His glory is fully revealed. If you came to this curious about the Eastern Gate, I hope you're leaving with clarity, grounded in what Scripture actually says rather than what speculation claims. If you came confused by dramatic assertions you've encountered, I hope you're leaving with peace. Because here's what I want you to carry with you. God's glory departed because of sin. God's glory returns because of grace. And one day the glory of God will fill all creation, not just a temple, not just a gate, but everything. That's the hope of Scripture. That's where prophecy points. That's what steadies the heart when we're tempted toward anxiety. Study Ezekiel's vision with interest. Hold your interpretations with humility. But let the passage accomplish what God intended, just to fill you with awe at His holiness and hope in His promise. He is not finished with His purposes, and He is not finished with you. If this careful approach to Scripture helped you understand this passage more clearly, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. We're committed to content that strengthens faith through biblical study, not sensational speculation. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what stood out to you most. And until next time, study faithfully, hold humbly, and rest in the God whose glory will one day fill all things.